democracy as managing disagreement and not just realizing unity. And so that, I think, is two different ways of understanding democracy that various Muslim thinkers have grappled with both of them.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning. On behalf of IAIS Malaysia, I would like to welcome our guest speaker and discussant, Professor Andrew Marsh, to this show. And we hope we will have a very enlightening discussion on politics, particularly from the Islamic perspective. So let me introduce you to our speaker and our discussant, Professor Andrew Marsh. He is Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts, USA, and also associated with the Harvard Kennedy School. His area of expertise is in Islam and politics, particularly caliphate, governance, Islamic State, and democracy, particularly the relationship between democracy and Islam, which he has already written in a book enlightening us on the theories put forward by Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi. And today we are going to discuss the relationship between democracy and Islam, governance, values, Islamic values in politics. So, Prof. Andrew, if you could talk a little bit about your works, what you've written, and your association with this Islam, politics and Islam. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you very, very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time in Malaysia, and I'm thrilled. And I'm so grateful for the hospitality and all the kindness that I've experienced so far. So I first want to begin by acknowledging that. I have written 2 books, and I've co-authored a book with Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi. My first book, which began as my dissertation at Oxford University, was called Islam and Liberal Citizenship, The Search for an Overlapping Consensus. And this was a book on, it was mostly on the discourse of fiqh al-aqaliyat, or the jurisprudence of Muslims living as minorities in non-Muslim liberal democracies. And it was a study of the political philosophy of citizenship and justice in diverse, plural societies, and how Islamic jurisprudence was developing and responding to these conditions. So I'm sure a lot of the listeners will remember that from the 1990s and on, there was an increasing interest in what was called fiqh al-aqaliyat by scholars in the Middle East, in Malaysia, and in Europe in particular. So my first book was a kind of comparative philosophical study of liberal political philosophy and the Islamic jurisprudence of minorities. My second book, which came out in 2019, was called The Caliphate of Man, Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought. And it was a study of the development of thinking about the people, or the ummah, as sovereign in Islam, along with God, from the beginning of modern Islamism, beginning with Maududi, Qutb, other thinkers, up to Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi. And it was a study of the concept of the people as God's Khalifa, or Caliph, and how this Quranic concept became increasingly central to modern Islamic thought, and how it developed in a number of ways into a theory of human agency, human nature, human psychology, and also human political agency in the public sphere. And that actually began with a reading of Sheikh Rashid's 1993 book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, or Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, which had a big influence on me. And so I organized that book as a sort of a history of that idea culminating in his thought, and then the efforts to create democracy in the Middle East after 2011. And during that time, I became acquainted with Sheikh. I arranged to have his book translated into English. And I got to know him and his family a little bit on visits to Tunisia. So we had the idea of translating more of his articles and essays and speeches, and also engaging in a philosophical dialogue between him and me on issues related to Islamic law, pluralism, democracy, freedom, the history of Islamic thought in the 20th century, his own political and intellectual trajectory, and those sorts of things. And that book came out last fall, unfortunately, a few months, almost a year after he was arrested and imprisoned in Tunisia.
Coming back to this, the development of Islamic political thought, I think, of course, political thinkers in the Islamic world and also the non-Muslim world, when they try to look into this subject area, of course, they will go back to the time of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, the Medina experience, the first Islamic state, as the reference point. But of course, throughout time, I mean, with the Islamic revival in the late 60s, early 70s, we find that there were so many scholars and activists, Muslim activists, trying to interpret the concept of Islamic state governance, and not really achieving what should have been achieved under the Islamic paradigm. Why do you think that these movements fail to achieve those the values or the structure or the governance of Islam at that time? Why do you think this happened?
It's a very good question. I suppose you could talk about success or failure on a number of levels. One would be the intellectual or theoretical or conceptual side. And there I would say that the record of 20th and 21st century Islamic political thought is quite rich. There are lots of very dense and complex theoretical elaborations around the idea of an Islamic constitution, the idea of how to apply Islamic law in modernity, quite an honest reckoning of the fact that the situation of Islamic law is different from what it was before the modern state, what aspects of Islamic law are merely a matter of applying classical fiqh, and what aspects of Islamic law have to be rethought through a kind of ijtihad on the part of variety of actors, ulama, ordinary people, politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So there, I would say that the record on the intellectual side is quite rich. And there's a very active, I think, debate that even involves a kind of self-criticism, reflecting upon previous generations of thought. So as a political theorist or a political philosopher, I find a lot that's very interesting in this body of thought. And I would say that every tradition, whether it's liberalism or other kinds of democracy or socialism or Marxism, have this dual aspect. They have their theoretical aspect that's elaborated in philosophical texts, in treatises, that creates its own debates and its own tradition and its own legacy. And then there are the efforts to bring this into reality. And those are never the same thing. And so democracies in the Western tradition look very different from what democratic theory would call for. Whoever you regard as the great examples of Western democratic theorists, liberal states look very different from what the best examples of philosophical liberalism would call for. Obviously, the legacy of socialism and Marxism is very mixed and is very different from the intellectual tradition. So I think we need to bear in mind that Islamism, if we use that term, the modern Islamic revival is no different. The modern Islamic revival is comparable to those other traditions because it's based in the beginning on a grand idea, right? It begins with an intellectual claim, a theological claim about the cosmos, about the place of God, about what humanity is, about the source of morality. All of these are not just ordinary political grievances, or they're not just sociological responses to discontent. They're great ideas, and so they belong in conversation and comparison with other great intellectual traditions. Now, when you look at the practical side, there are many examples of where the Islamic movement has only been an oppositional movement. It's been kept out of power. Yeah. And there are examples where it has achieved total power, like in Iran. And there's examples of where the state has combined aspects of the Islamic vision, and Islamist movements have some participation in power. So Pakistan, Egypt at some periods of time, perhaps Malaysia. And so when you look at all of these cases, I don't think it's, I wouldn't begin by asking why has it failed. I would say, what has the experience of actually trying to capture political power, create a state, or share political power taught us about the relevance or the ability to guide action on the part of the theoretical tradition? That's how I would frame it.
Okay. So when you talked about democracy, especially as a system, and I think democracy is now the thing that we would look into, is because critics of the Islamic political thought and governance seem to look at this. If you bring Islam into society, it will curtail freedoms and things like that. So this is not the right thing to do under democracy. So the relationship between Islam and democracy, and especially as in your book with Sheikh Rachid Ghannouchi, you talk about Islam and democracy. So can you elaborate on this?
Yeah.
Because is there a problem there?
Yeah.
Between democracy and Islam, or there is no problem whatsoever? It lies in the interpretation of democracy itself.
Yes. I like your question very much, because your question doesn't just begin with Islam as the question, assuming that we know what democracy is. But it begins with democracy also as a problem, because there are many interpretations of democracy. We don't necessarily know how to rank order different values from a democratic perspective. And democracy is not the same thing as all good things. So democracy has its costs, it has its benefits, and there are very few even theories of pure democracy in which democracy is not somehow moderated with constitutionalism or rights or something like that. So I like your question very much. I want to begin there. I want to begin actually by saying that from the beginning of the modern Islamic revival, the, let's just use the term Islamist, intellectual tradition, has actually had a somewhat open relationship to democracy. And this is somewhat surprising, because we often think that the turn to democracy on the part of the Islamic revival is a later thing, on the part of thinkers like Ghannouchi, or in Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir, and so forth. And in reality, when you go back and you read even Maududi, who begins by saying all of Islamic political thought begins with divine sovereignty or hekimiyya, or a complete rejection of Western democracy, a complete rejection of the idea of popular sovereignty. At the same time, in his earliest writings, Maududi is saying, but Islam is not a dictatorship. Islam is a kind of theo-democracy. That was his term. And it's Maududi that really begins by saying that the way to understand the Islamic State is that the people is God's Khalifa. And so the people has this responsibility and agency to bring about a state with certain kinds of commitments and values. So I want to begin by saying that this idea that we ask about Islam's relationship to democracy is not just something that comes from outside. It's not just Westerners saying, be democratic, or why aren't you democratic, or prove to us that you're democratic. It's something that even Hassan al-Banna talks about parliamentary democracy, and Maududi and others. So I want to make that very clear. And so the second thing is let's begin with two ways of understanding democracy. The first way of understanding democracy is by assuming that the people has a certain kind of shared will or interest and needs to be allowed to govern. And so the people must be allowed to govern over its rulers, its army, its occupiers, or something like that. So it's a problem of how the people, with a shared will, a shared desire, a unitary set of interests, can govern. The second way of understanding democracy is by saying the people are divided. They could be divided based on language or ethnicity. They can also be divided based on ideology. They can be divided based on interests. And there's no way of creating a single vision, a single set of interests that everybody can agree upon. So democracy is a way of managing that difference and disagreement to avoid dictatorship or to avoid violence. And one of my main arguments across my last two books is that the Islamic theorization of democracy has spanned both of those ideas. And so when you read thinkers like Maududi or Ghannouchi in his earlier phase, there's a certain assumption that the people, the ummah, is more or less unified. Everybody's Muslim.
Yes.
Not everybody's perfect, but most people are believers. The people, in the singular, the ummah, is a believing people, ummah mu'mina, and is more or less agreed about God, the Quran, Islam, maybe about what the Sharia is, and therefore what the purpose of politics is. And the purpose of politics is to allow the ummah to govern itself freely, but also while being faithful to God. But then, in areas, in times and places when Islamist parties have had to govern, there's this realization that not everybody shares these same agreements. And I'm sure Malaysia is another very good example of this, where you have many different political parties. Some of them are less religious, some are hostile to religion, some are very secular, some are communist. And so then you realize, which is very different from the theory, that Muslim societies are no exception to the law of pluralism. Muslims also disagree about what the priority for politics should be. Or maybe society is not only comprised of Muslims. And so then you need a second theory about how does Islam rationalize and affirm democracy as managing disagreement and not just realizing unity. And so that, I think, is two different ways of understanding democracy that various Muslim thinkers have grappled with both of them.
Yeah, on your point on this pluralism, because of course society has divergent views on many things. especially moral values, things which you say that the values of society generally, they are, you know, in this kind of a context. Uh, I would like you to explain a little bit more on the pluralism of how pluralism is attended to in society in relation to Islam. Okay, Islam has a set of values, and then you have society which is plural in its
Yeah.
assumptions of what values stand for. How will you
Yeah.
reconcile this?
Well, let's begin with this observation. Lots of modern Islamic thought has attempted to treat modernity and the ideal of a modern Islamic state as much as possible by using the concepts of classical Islamic thought and classical fiqh. So you have all of the concepts of classical fiqh, Dar al-Islam, the Ummah, the bay'ah to the ruler, shura, ahlul halwa al-aqd, ahlul dhimma. So you have all of these concepts that if you read classical works of jurisprudence, some thinkers try to apply to the modern state. And so there, I think you have the assumption, sociologically, that the world is mostly composed of different religious groups. Everybody's religious, and everybody belongs to a millah, or a millet. And so the assumption is also that in an Islamic state or an Islamic society, Muslims are the majority, and all Muslims are Muslim. They're not socialist, they're not feminist,
Yes.
they're not secularist, etc.
Yeah.
And so there you have a concept of toleration. Muslims are the majority, but we tolerate Christians, we tolerate Jews. Everybody doesn't have to be Muslim. We don't convert people. People have their churches, their synagogues. They can drink their wine and eat their pork in private. And so that's the model. In a lot of modern Islamic thought, even, like I said, Ghannouchi's earlier book, which is very tolerant, which is all about public freedoms, which is all about democracy, still mostly assumes that the majority is Muslim. And it says there can be other parties. There can be even socialist or communist parties.
Yes.
And they have rights as long as they recognize the Islamic character of the state. And that's very different from what eventually happens in Tunisia after 2011. And so you asked about understanding pluralism in actual society. And I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is that you begin by acknowledging that many societies have many non-Muslims. So Malaysia is a great example, right? Many Chinese, many Indians, people belong to different religions. And that gives, India is another example. And that gives another just way of beginning in terms of how you think about society. But I think a harder question that Muslim thinkers don't often like to talk about is all of these people that have Muslim names and Muslim parents and grandparents might not be very religious.
Yes.
And they might not see their purpose in politics and life as living up to Islamic norms. And so that's a kind of pluralism that I think is harder to theorize. How do you begin with that, right? Is it reasonable for Muslims to have this disagreement or to not be very pious or not be very religious? Is that something that you acknowledge politically, or is it something that you just assume will go away when society is governed in a more just or a more religious way? So let me finish answering the question by saying this. There are many ways to do political theory, but here's one division. One is that you begin with an ideal, and then you theorize the ideal, you get all of that worked out, and then you worry about how to apply it in practice. And you recognize that there will be compromises, it's never going to be perfect, but the ideal is still guiding you. And that ideal comes from maybe theology or philosophy or basic moral principles. And then you say, well, society, okay, it's always messy, but theory comes first. Another way is to say, let's begin with society. How is society actually composed? Where does power lie? How do people act? What do people want? And then you begin with actual politics and you identify what are the greatest benefits, maslaha, masalih, what are the greatest harms that you're trying to avoid. And it's a very different way of viewing politics, beginning from the ground and then moving to abstraction. But of course, in the Islamic tradition, there's a very great example of this. Ibn Khaldun, who was obviously one of the greatest thinkers in the medieval Islamic tradition, a historian, a theorist of society, a sociologist, also a jurist, also a judge. But he began by saying, where do all of these states come from, right? They come from one tribal rebellion after another. Why do people come to power? They come to power because they have asabiyah. They have this tribal connection. They're tough. They come from the desert. They're not lazy or spoiled by civilization. And so you begin with all of these facts as opposed to theory. And then your view of politics starts to look very different. So I know I went on and on, but I want to say that this is one of the areas of modern Islamic thought that interests me very much, which is this tension between saying Islam is practical, Islam is pragmatic, Islam adapts to reality, but it still begins with these very abstract claims versus saying, what is the political world really like? And I think you get two very different theories of politics in that way. In fact, if we could talk about it later, but you even get two very different theories of Medina. What was Medina all about? What was this first Islamic state all about? You get two very different stories of what that lesson holds, depending on what aspect of politics you're interested in.
In the context of Malaysia, I would like to relate to you what we are now undergoing under the new leadership of the current Prime Minister, who has introduced the concept of Madani. So
Yes.
Madani, you
Yes.
would have heard of it, and Madani is more to the values.
Yes.
It's more to the values. Islam, he doesn't say it as Islamic values, but of course it's derived from Islam. For example, ethics, ethical leadership, good governance, things like this, and also attending to the needs of the people, the basic needs of the people, to develop the nation, to progress, things like this, values which are going to uplift the ummah,
Yes.
put it. Now, how would you see this as a solution to what we have in the context of, if it is a purely Muslim society, it would be much easier to manage with Islam there, say imposition of Islamic values, laws or whatever. But in the context of a country like Malaysia, which is multi-religious, multicultural and multi-ethnic, with different belief systems and things like that, we have come up with this Madani, which is guiding us now. And could you look at it, have a few words on this?
I would love to learn more about how the concept of Madani is used in Malaysia. You've really made me curious, because it's a concept that has a very prominent place in modern Islamic thought. The first time I'm aware of it even comes in the early 1920s, after the Turks got rid of the caliphate, and you had some figures that are trying to restore the caliphate. So in the Syrian Egyptian thinker Rachid Ghannouchi, he writes a number of essays that come together as a book called El Khilafa, and he organized a big conference to try to restore the Khilafah. I'm sure there were Malaysian representatives there. And he's talking about the problem of pluralism, and he's talking about Jews and Christians and other minorities. And he gives one of the first arguments that I'm aware of in the 20th century, saying non-Muslims have nothing to fear from the Khilafah, because the Khilafah is not really a sacred institution. It's a Madani institution. It's civil. And in Sunni thought, this is a very, very common argument to say that unlike the Catholics and unlike the Shia, for us, the state is simply a civil matter. It doesn't govern souls. It doesn't govern aqidah. It just governs society in a civil way. Now, of course, it is regulated by religion. It's regulated by the Sharia, but it only pertains to civil matters. And in my opinion, this becomes a very, very popular concept because it allows certain thinkers to talk about the state as limited, as not totalitarian, as not religiously oppressive, without using the word secular. Because nobody wants to say that it's secular, ilmani. I'm not sure what the Malay term for secular is. But saying Madani is very different. First of all, it comes from Medina, city, civil, the same origin, etymology as in English. And it allows thinkers to say a number of things. One, that again, the state is limited, it's not sacred, it doesn't claim governance of souls. Two, that Islam is practical. Islam is about regulating all of these worldly matters, which means both that Islamic law has answers to these things, but also that it has to be flexible. If the purpose of religion or of law is to make people's worldly lives better, then it also has to react to this. It has to respond to practical situations. It has to be flexible. It can't assume that everything is already regulated by the divine law. And it allows thinkers to focus on people's well-being in this world. So, and I think finally, and maybe I've already kind of hinted at this, what exactly Madani values require is kind of vague, right? It could be more economic development. It could be less economic development. It could be, right, to preserve the environment or to preserve culture. So it really leaves it up to politics to decide what these values require. It's not something that's already given or predetermined by religion. So I think that's another reason why that concept is so popular, because it's very responsive to what politics is. And politics is always changing. It's always about contestation and struggle between various actors and groups. It's about compromise. It's about responding to situations that you didn't create. And so I think that's another reason why that is a very useful concept. But again, I'd love to hear more about how it's used in Malaysia and what values it's sort of associated with.
Yeah, because of course in the under the current administration of our current Prime Minister, Madani is the driving, you might say, the ideology.
Yes.
That guides the country. And of course, you want to achieve the best for the nation. And I think the Madani concept is, if really understood by all sectors of society, it will bring us to greater heights. In this.
Is it something that non-Malays or non-Muslims identify with and use and make reference to?
It is still quite new.
Okay.
It is still quite new. The Prime Minister, of course, we will say, I wouldn't say he's alone, but it appears that he's the only one who is always talking about it. And there are, of course, the government is in putting it into practice. But has it really come down to the lower levels of society, to the non-Muslim communities, to really understand and practice those values that are known as Madani values? You know, so
Not yet.
It's quite a simple concept actually.
Yeah.
But then because the term is used, Madani, in that as if it is, something, out of this world or something like that.
Yeah.
It isn't. It is something practical, and it is, it will change.
And flexible, it
society.
sounds like.
Flexible,
Yeah.
yes. So, okay, I'd like to go to another area,
Great.
which we were discussing earlier. That is about democracy. You were saying the different interpretations. Currently, especially in the US, the students are now rising up against what is happening in Gaza, and you can see how the US administration is facing this student protest against it. But the protest itself is, of course, something which is, you would say, democratic practice, the freedom to voice out something which, to the students and of course society at large, is not proper. The genocide that is going on in Gaza.
Yes.
But the manner in which the administration is clamping down on these protests. So, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. From a democratic theory standpoint, let me raise a few questions about this. One, which is, any good democracy allows for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest, freedom to do all kinds of things. These are within the law. So the law should not prevent you from a number of things. But democratic theory also asks, when are you allowed to break the law? Right? We call this civil disobedience. Yeah. And so there's a long tradition of saying we're acting within the law, but then there's also a tradition of saying, no, we're breaking the law. We know that this is a law, and we're breaking it. And we're breaking it either to show that the law is unjustified, or we're breaking the law to bring attention to something else. And so the crackdown on many of the student protests is a complicated question for democracy, because a lot of the protests are happening on private property. Many of the universities are private, Harvard, other universities. Some of them are public universities, UCLA, Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing I'm not trying to dismiss the question, but I want to say, we should think about when protests themselves are presented as just part of democratic process, and other times in which they're deliberately breaking the law. The other aspect is you have certain kinds of institutions that are neither purely private nor purely public, but are part of civil society. And so universities are some of the best examples of this, because even when universities are private, they see themselves as having a very great civic, democratic role. Universities love to praise themselves for how important they are for society in the future. We're training our future leaders. We are the conscience of the country. Universities love to use their own past as propaganda, right? Students protested the Vietnam War, or they protested apartheid. So universities are a very interesting institution for thinking about democracy, because sometimes they're private, but they're private with a claim that they serve the public interest. Okay, so with that, I guess we have two questions. One, what should students say they are doing? Should they say, we are doing something within the law, and we want our protests to be within the law? Or do they want to say, even if we're breaking the law, we think that that's justified to bring attention to what's going on in Gaza? So then you have the opposite question. If they are not breaking the law, Is it an atrocity, a legal atrocity that universities are cracking down on them with police? Or if they are breaking the law, what should universities do? Should they tolerate it because they recognize that it's for public political speech, that they have a message, that it's driven out of conscience as opposed to private interest or something like that? These are not easy questions. Sometimes when movements break the law, they want to be arrested. They want to be cracked down on because they want to bring attention to this. So many of the great democratizing or civil disobedience movements, Gandhi, the civil rights movement in America, they set out to be arrested. They didn't say, it's wrong to arrest us. They knew they were going to be arrested, and they did that, one, to get attention, so people would see that these laws are unjust, but also, and this is sometimes hard to remember, there was often a claim that they did this out of love for the legal system. We're letting ourselves be arrested because we want to be within the law, because we want the law to change. Okay, that's a bit of a long-winded introduction. The interesting thing about the Gaza protests is that the place where it's happening is partly the target of the protest, but partly it's just a site to bring attention. So sometimes the students are saying, you universities are complicit. Columbia, Harvard, you have investments in Israel or in weapons manufacturers. So we're protesting against you to get you to change. That's part of it. But part of it is also, these are very big public places. Harvard, something happens at Harvard and it's news in Malaysia. It's news in Argentina. It's a big deal. Columbia, right? UCLA. So part of it is to say, we're students here. This is where we can protest and it will get attention. But our message is much bigger than the university. It's about bringing everybody's attention to what's happening in Gaza and the complicity of the United States as a whole. So I'm not going to give you a clear answer. I just want to say that there's no single answer from a democratic perspective, right? Which is to say, democracy has laws. Democracy doesn't allow everything. Democracy often cracks down on protests. But it's part of the broader mission of being a democratic people, that the people has to judge, why is one protest different from another? If Trump supporters protest an election that wasn't stolen and they attack Congress, they're breaking the law. Just like students who invade a building and occupy it are breaking the law. But it's the people that has to judge why those are two different things. Right? Why the values are different, the goal is different, and the ultimate impact on democracy is different. So again, it's not an easy question, or an easy answer to your question. It's just to say that democracy is complicated. It's about electing representatives, it's about creating laws, but it's also about creating a people that over time can make judgments about what was a good breaking of the law and what was a bad breaking of the law.
Yes, as you were mentioning, but I think we here in Malaysia, when we were following these reports of the protests in the US, our main focus was, and of course understanding was, that these students were just plainly protesting the genocide that was going on, that is still going on in Gaza.
Yes.
And this must be stopped, because no human being in his right mind will agree with what is going on in Gaza.
Yes.
It's terrible. And that thing has to stop.
Yes.
And no, they don't want their institutions to be complicit.
Correct.
In the process of carrying out the genocide. It's plain and simple, just about that.
Well, so that's where it gets complicated, because it's not just about that. Because the students are smart. and the students have bigger ideas. If it were just about stop the genocide, stop the attack on Gaza, that would be simple. But the students have many other slogans. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Yeah. Globalize the intifada. And those are all legitimate slogans in a democracy. Yeah. But their idea, so this is where it gets complicated, because the question is, what is enough? Is it just having a ceasefire? Is it divesting from Israel? Is it a one-state solution? Is it a two-state solution? So the students are protesting for bigger things, but the protests are also varied. Some are just focusing on the atrocities in Gaza. Yeah. Some have other kinds of slogans, and that's where it becomes divisive, and that's where opponents will make use of those divisions. They want to say, oh, if they were just protesting what's going on in Gaza, I would support them. But they're also saying from the river to the sea, so I can't support them. What they really want is for all the Jews to leave, or worse, maybe all the Jews to be killed. And so people that are hostile will say the students are actually advancing slogans that are so radical that we shouldn't have to listen to them. And that's another democratic question, right? I'm not here to admonish or criticize the students, but we're talking about democracy. And so democracy is about persuasion. It's about creating new majorities or new coalitions. And so it's about different kinds of publics. Who is the audience for a protest? Is it the whole world? Is it the people in Gaza? Do you want the people in Gaza to know that some people here are with you? Is it other Americans? Is it Americans that are not necessarily already educated about Palestine? And so thinking about democracy and thinking about protest is a complicated thing. When you have figures like Gandhi organizing protest, this is why Gandhi is such an important political philosopher, because he's thinking about what action does, right? What action does is it creates a future, and it creates future relationships. And so he says, when you act, you're creating yourself. A person that has done violence is never the same. A relationship between two people in which there's been violence is never the same. So you're not just protesting or expressing or trying to get something, you're thinking about the future. Martin Luther King in the United States was always thinking about different kinds of audiences, other African Americans, different parts of the white population. And so that's part of also what protest is in a democracy, is you're thinking about who your public is. And so again, that's why there's no easy answer to your question, because every citizen or every group or every organization has their own responsibility to be thinking about these questions. There's no answer that comes from philosophy or from the law that says every protest has to think about these people as their audience. This is something that political actors have to think about as they enter politics.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Andrew, for your very enlightening views
Thank you.
on Islam, Islamic political thought, democracy, and events that are taking place, especially now in the United States. We have just been listening to a very exciting and a very interesting talk and discussion by Professor Andrew Marsh. And on behalf of IAIS, I would like to thank Prof. Andrew for his views. And inshallah, we will meet again. Inshallah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much.